Okay, everybody. Good morning, evening, or afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. Welcome to this afternoon's session from the Financial Services Club. If you would like to ask questions before we start, just to let you know that there's a panel on the right-hand side that you can expand, and you'll also see there access to the two handouts that we've got for today, which are a copy of these slides and the report, Learning from Past Financial Scandals, that we're going to refer to quite a bit. So again, welcome. I'm assuming that most of you are working remotely. Challenging times indeed. I hope everyone is well. And I suspect that my sense is that this might change the way that many of us work permanently going forward. So there's a lot for us all to get used to, but I think it's becoming more familiar for everyone indeed. This is the latest in a series of webinars as we move a little bit away temporarily, certainly, from the physical events. We kicked off a couple of days ago with the launch of an anti-money laundering task force. So it's quite appropriate, perhaps, that today we maybe look at the other side of the coin, so to speak, and some of the scandals and maybe what we can learn from those in terms of things that have hit the financial services industry over recent years. So again, thank you to some of the sponsors and members of the FS that are shown on the screen at the moment. And the agenda for the upcoming half an hour, you're going to hear a little bit from me, no more than 4 or 5 minutes. And then I'm going to hand over to our keynote speaker, Professor Tim Connell, who's an Honorary Life Fellow of Gresham College and the primary author of the report we published almost exactly 2 years ago now. There will be time for questions and answers, so please feel free to type questions in as we go, and I will get to as many of those as I can and read them out. And I'm assuming mostly Tim, potentially me as well, will look to answer your questions. So brief note for me, as many of you will know, we've been running the Financial Services Club for 1 year now. Our big theme, if you like, has been about news, events, and partnerships. It's from a news perspective. We have a series of daily emails, links to Chris Skinner's blog, and more recently, we've introduced over 200 different themes of personalized bulletins that you can subscribe to. So here's an example on screen of the anti-money laundering one that we have launched recently on the back of the AML webinar held a few days ago. So please do feel free to explore the various bulletins that are available to you. In terms of events, of course, I know many of you will have been to lots of the FS Club events. These are some of the pictures from the last 6 months. We hold various venues, different formats, and so on and so forth. But of course, that isn't going to be happening for a few months. And what we will be doing is focusing on webinars. Here's an idea of some of the things that we've got coming up. Some of those will be subject to change in terms of the titles or potentially the dates, and we may indeed be adding quite a few more as well. So do please watch out for upcoming webinars, and we do hope that many of you can join us. Of course, we're also about partnerships. Some of the partners that we currently work with are shown on screen, and perhaps quite relevantly, we now do offer CPD points through CISI, and others will be added as well. So we're very keen on entering into partnerships, news, events, partnerships. That's the FS Club. So the report that Tim is going to refer to some degree is something that we issued, as I say, almost exactly 2 years ago under our distributed futures or mutual distributed ledger research. Sorry, mutual distributed ledger research program, and this was actually one of my favourite reports, I think, because I'm a financial services investment operations background myself, and this report is definitely worth a read. Pages 18 to 24 are specifically good, I think, because it gives the briefest of overviews into some historic scandals, ranging from the ancient Romans, believe it or not, and devaluations of currency, through to Medici, tulip mania, Mississippi and South Sea bubbles, up to the proliferation of railway shares scandals in the mid 19th century. So that's enough from me. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Professor Tim Connell, and I will be driving the slides. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, James. Let's have the first slide then. Right, well, good morning, everybody. It's interesting that James likes the historical bit in the report. The depressing part of this, of course, is that scandals always do seem to have been with us. And the question then is, do they always have to be? So you can see from this particular screen that we've got a series of items here. I'd refer particularly, I think, to the latter end of the report, the good guys, scandals and how to avoid them. Because, of course, the interesting thing is that every time a scandal breaks, everybody stands back and says, good heavens, how could that happen? Nobody saw it coming. Let's make sure this never happens again. And it makes you wonder what the non-execs were doing, what the auditors were doing, what the accountants were doing, what the shareholders were saying. And it does seem that there is something of a mismatch between the good practice and the reality. James, on to the next slide, please. Now, if we look back on this, as I say, is it greed? Is it something which comes as a byproduct? You can't be a doctor unless there's disease. Is corruption part of a system? Is it part of human nature? Illegality is something which the law is there to prevent. To what extent does it succeed? Fraud, well, it can be minor, can be major, can be something which gets out of control. In the world of globalization, we have to think about the world scale. And of course, with larger organizations, we have to look at institutional corruption and wonder whether there is a fault in the system or does the fault lie with the people inside it. And of course, on the right-hand side, we have the modern day issue of cybercrime. Now, down at the bottom, I bet you've all heard these phrases at some time in the past: cooking the books, fingers in the till, snouts in the trough. And of course, James has just referred to bubble and bust mania, whereby the herd instinct kicks in. The example I always like to give, because it's a fairly recent one, was Poseidon, which was a mining venture in Australia where it was thought that a vast deposit of nickel had been discovered in Western Australia. At the time of the Vietnam War, late 1960s, it was a strategic metal. People ploughed in, and in UK money, it went up from sixpence in the old money to £110 per share. I remember this very clearly because a friend of mine was actually able to get shares at sixpence and thought he'd done very well by selling out at £2 10 shillings. Okay, on to the next one. Yes, now, in the middle there, no, not the future, James, back one. Yes, in the middle there, you've got the well-run, profitable business. Now, almost that goes back in the other direction. If the business is well-run, one hopes that it will be profitable. Now, what could be done in a well-run, profitable business, we trust that this is actually happening, starts at the top with training. The financial world gets more and more complex, it gets more and more regulated, and I have to say, I'm not saying there's a mismatch between what is being taught in the universities and what you need to know on the ground if you're working in finance, but there is a security link between the two, whereby you need to take your professional body qualifications in many cases before you're actually allowed to practice. We then go round clockwise to transparency. This is a very straightforward one, and I hate phrases like a need to know basis. If there's nothing wrong, there's no reason why the right people shouldn't actually know. This goes back to my auditors, it goes back to my non-execs, and yes, to some extent it goes back to the shareholders, of course, who do stand to lose out. What people fall back on is due regulation. Is the regulation up to date, or do you shut the door after the horse has bolted? Are you following proper procedures, which links in itself to good practice? And underlying this, there's ethics. You go back to the good old days where my word was my bond. No decent chap would do nasty things to his company, etc., etc. And because it was a relatively small world, there was a lot of social pressure on conformity. Then, of course, underlying all that, you have legal sanctions at one end of the scale, and of course the fear of getting caught out at the other. Now, I stress here that this is not victimless crime. Yes, there's no blood on the floor, there's no burnt down building for an insurance scam, but reputational damage on the left. Is your company going to lose its good name, and are people going to disinvest or stay away from it because of the things they've heard about it? A share collapse. Well, the small investors lose their shirt. The pension companies find they don't have the reserves to pay our pensions. This is a serious issue for absolutely everybody. Financial restitution, well, to what extent do you get paid back for what you've lost? And in the modern world, there are these swinging fines for organizations. The Americans are particularly fond of imposing fines in hundreds of millions of dollars. And of course, the other option is a sanction. And at the other end, you have company failure, think of Lehman Brothers. And at the far end, Bernie Madoff and jail. Next screen, please, James. So we go on to the future, top left there. We've got a very fast moving world whereby fintech is the application of all sorts of new computer inventions linked to the world of finance, very, very fast moving. I suspect my grandson aged 8 understands this better than I do. You have the cryptocurrencies. I think we were rather concerned that was going to be the latest bubble and mania, but it seems to have settled down. Some governments are even issuing their own crypto currency. There are rumors that both North Korea and Venezuela quite like to use them. And of course, the whole of the AI question as to whether machines can replace humans. And this then leads us into things like high future trading. Now, on the right-hand side at the top, you've got things that don't change. The culture that you're working in. If it's dog eat dog, every man for himself, devil take the hindmost, you don't have a long-term stable structure. These, I think, you can find if you establish standards. They're based on ethical issues that people understand, and they're backed by jurisdictions which have teeth to enforce the regulations themselves. So there we have the circle in the middle, the technology, the global challenges, the politics inevitably, and of course the question on the left of not so much government debt as finances. Now, down at the bottom, you see when we get to the end as a prelude to question time, we've got a series of recommendations under the headings policy, procedures, structures, and training. James, on to the next. So, what did we find? Firstly, in my 103 pages, there are also 215 footnotes. So if you want to say, where on earth did he find that? Or I didn't know anything about Sarbanes-Oxley or whatever, there is a link online to take you through to it. And all of this is actually in the public domain, though I have to say it did take me some time to track some of it down. Now, what did we come to conclude? Well, first of all, too much detailed regulation. There is always a danger that good practice gets morphed into form filling, a boring activity which takes place at a particular time of year. I'm put in mind of the academic world, where we have the aptly named APES, the academic program evaluation, which really seems to be more and more looking at the figures and trying to draw some conclusions from the figures, and not actually sitting around and saying, look, can we do it better? Now, I always mention I set up a new organization about 30 years ago, and it had been running for 2 or 3 years. We thought it was time to take a look at it. And we got in this very nice retired businessman, and he drove us mad because for the first 2 or 3 days he said, what days are your Spanish classes? Oh, Tuesdays. Why do you do Tuesdays? Well, we do Tuesdays. How much do you charge per head? I don't know, £75. Why not 70? Why not 80? And he asked us these damn silly questions, we thought, until of course we twigged. What he was saying was, because it worked last year, could you do it better next year? Now, we didn't have any forms to fill in. What we had was a very experienced person asking us some very intelligent questions, and I think we came out of it very well. Now, the other thing about the regulations, number 2, if they're very complex, are they actually going to detect or prevent financial scandals? All too often we find either the regulation doesn't fit in to what can actually be done with particularly the latest technology, or people didn't see it coming, and therefore, of course, it's a stable door slamming very loudly, and everybody saying, good Lord, how did that happen? One size of regulation. Now you have massive multinational companies, and you have the small one-man bands. You have a large number of SMEs in the square mile, for example? Do you want to burden them with regulation which is taking valuable time away from them where they need to be earning money in order to survive? Now, the other thing is, I mentioned these swinging fines that the Americans are particularly fond of, though I'm not picking on them in particular. These are very severe, and they do seem to crop up with some regularity, but they don't seem to stop the scandals. And this might be because under number 5, people are going through the form and the process, and there's not the actual substance underneath. I come back to the financial policeman who ought to be the auditor, the accountant, the non-execs, and also difficult questions at the annual shareholders meeting. Now, globalization is many faceted. We go back to the Big Bang in 1986, which some of you will probably remember. The City of London absolutely turned on its head in comparison to what we have today. We have trading, which can take thousands of times per second. We have the artificial intelligence. We have all of these new areas of fintech, not only on the horizon, but with us now. Now, when you look across the world, you've got a further issue here, which is people do business in different ways. Now, I'm sure you've been on one of those training courses where they teach you how to accept a business card from the Japanese and how long it takes to do business in South America, etc., etc. People do things differently because they think differently. And if you're working together, this does obviously have benefits, otherwise we wouldn't do it. It also has traps. I'm thinking of HSBC, which bought a bank in Mexico some years ago. This is in the report. And what they didn't realize was the bank in Mexico had not had proper regulation and control. It therefore had been tainted by drugs money. The American regulators found this out and clobbered HSBC, even though strictly speaking, it wasn't their particular fault. And this means that major financial centers, and of course I'm thinking of the square mile here, have to develop their own specific agents of change to address the financial scandals. That's the negative end of it. They should be addressing methods and ways in which such scandals are either not possible, or they're not attractive, or you just can't get away with it, which I think is the important thing at the end. Okay, James, on to the next frame, please. Right, so these were the recommendations which we came up with. So starting with the dark blue, the policy, can I draw your attention on the right? Civic, this was Charles Bowman in his year as Lord Mayor a couple of years ago, who supported this report. Competence and skills, integrity, value to society, interest of others, clear communication. Keep it simple, and these were the findings which came out of a very detailed survey of very high-flying city figures and a forum for ordinary city workers. And these boiled down are the key items which need to be looked at. So as far as policy is concerned, I'd look at ethical standards, ways of maximizing effort, reducing costs, and with regard to closer cooperation at international level, as I say, be aware of the fact that things are not always done in the same way as here. Since 2008, which was a very black year, and we're heading into very unknown waters now, the procedures for regulation and compliance, the items which have been put in place in the last 10 years, 12 years, have they worked? If they haven't, why not? And if they haven't, what do we do about them? And also, can you think outside the box? New commercial developments, electronic advances, changes in the law. Someone needs to sit back and say, if I were the burglar, how would I get into the house? Okay, James, next one, please. We're on to 1220. So, procedures. I don't think from the feedback we had that more legal powers are wanted because there were regular complaints about time-consuming and frustrating red tape. You don't need to have so many processes, I'm sure, but they do need to be more robust. And you do need to stay away from box-ticking exercises whereby people think, well, that's it, I've done it, that's okay, and don't ask themselves the question whether it really is. Best working practices. Well, that's something which can be looked at across all professional services. And of course, new enterprises, particularly those coming out in these very forward-looking areas of technology, can you strengthen identity and verification checks? Do you know precisely who you are dealing with? And if you look at the Transparency International website, you might want to get onto their newsletter, which keeps you very up to date on this. The fact that companies can be set up around the world without necessarily having to say who they belong to seems to be a driver in the growth of scandal and malpractice. James, next one. Structures. Well, I would say City of London, global financial reputation at the centre of things, and it's important for us to make sure it stays there. Ethical attitudes. These are the things which we know we should be doing. We know these are things which will end in failure or tears. Legal structures, commercial processes, yes, they can be different across jurisdictions. You've got different political structures, different business processes. If you're going to be a world centre, it would be very nice if everyone came to the City of London and did things precisely the way that we do, but I don't think that's the way that the world works. Skills and resources, there's a lot being put in here to control fraud, and particularly the e-criminals, these commercial and law enforcement agencies. But again, we need to stay ahead of the crooks. If the people who are chasing them don't know as much as the crooks, they're not going to catch them. And at the bottom, commercial, professional, higher education institutions, I'm not just plugging the universities, very good professional bodies work in this area as well, but to make sure that developments are reviewed, consolidated, and put into practice. Unfortunately, all too often, people write a report, they publish it, everyone says jolly good, and then shelves it. And that's something we need to avoid. Next one, James. Training. Well, we go right way back to the first of my slides here. You need to teach and get this embedded in teaching and training from the very beginning and right the way through. And that also means to say people need to keep up to date, especially, I come back again to fintech, algorithms, artificial intelligence. These are very fast moving areas, and people do need to know not only about them, but they do need to know the implications of working in these areas. So CPD, I know a shudder goes through the audience when I say CPD, but the right programs addressing the right issues are really very important. And we did suggest, particularly for smaller companies, it would be beneficial if there were to be tax relief on the cost of keeping everybody up to date. Because the alternative to not keeping people up to date is that somewhere along the line, people are going to lose a lot of money because of fraud. And the research into new technologies, well, I'm sure that's going on all the time, but add the loop at the bottom, external oversight. James, next one, please. That takes us into question time. What questions have we got, James?
Okay, that was perfect timing, Tim. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions coming in. If you're online and maybe joined us a little late, there's a panel on your right-hand side where you can submit questions, and I will read them out to Tim. Let me start with a very topical one, first of all, Tim. Pretty much the whole world is working from home at the moment and not going out. So there's an expectation that the crime rate statistics for the coming weeks will be incredibly low. That said, of course, financial scandals and hacking and so on is often driven from home. So the question is, do you think there'll be an increase or a decrease in the level of financial scandals?
Well, I'm afraid only time will tell. We can confidently predict that the number of burglaries will go down because everyone's at home. The number of car thefts will go down because there's so few cars on the road the police will spot anything that's hot. But as you say, it's so easy to run a major hack from your back bedroom, as a fair number of people have done. So I rather fear that we could see a rise in financial internet scams. Our local police force, which is Surrey, has just sent round a message to all of us to say, be very careful for fraud disguised as advice on the coronavirus. I've had several of these messages already coming from what look like reputable sources, saying click here for the latest information on corona, or click here for a bargain deal for masks and gloves, And of course, your details get sent through to the hackers and you find yourself in trouble. Social isolation. Yes, if people don't have someone looking over their shoulder, are they going to think they're going to get away from it? What about oversight? If you're not in the office, if you're not in day-to-day contact with your auditors or your, your overseers, do you think you're more likely to get away with it? Will things be relaxed? We keep on hearing over the net about, oh, you're going to have a mortgage holiday, oh, you're going to get this, you're going to get that. Does this mean to say people will let their defensives down? And that, I think, is really rather dangerous. Now, are we going to get anonymous blogs manipulating the markets, sending out bogus details about shares to follow, etc.? Are people sitting at home trying to work the markets from a distance? If the markets are thinner, does this mean to say that the financial environment is going to get hotter? Is there likely to be stock manipulation if there's not the proper oversight on a day-to-day basis, which we would have if everyone was at work? And will transparency go down? Corporate results reporting by financial institutions. Let's be fair, in the present climate, it might just not be possible to be able to give a clear picture. So early days, but I would say let's be very much on the alert, especially with regard to computer scams, and let's watch with care what goes on, particularly in the markets.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Here's a very specific question. The short answer might rule out a longer answer, but are you familiar with the financial services regulations in Japan? And if yes, have Tobashi scandals such as the Olympic one made an impact on their regulatory systems?
I think the whole thing is too recent to say. It's something which is emerging. I hear on the radio this morning that the cost of cancelling or postponing the Olympics is $200 billion. And this, I think, is very important. But it goes back to my point that London might be a global financial centre, but Japan, very reputable, huge amounts of money in their markets. You do need, I think, in a situation like this, not just to go online and read about it. If this is serious for your particular organisation, you need expert advice. And one positive thing about the City of London is expert advice is always to be found there. Get onto the commercial attaché at the Japanese embassy and get recommended. Don't just pick a name off the net. Go through someone who is reputable and who knows what they're doing when they give you advice.
Okay, great. Let's get another question. Should all public companies publicly disclose the ownership and control of their shareholders to reveal potential insider traders? And perhaps a second part to that related, should all share traders be informed of who they are dealing with before executing a trade? That's an interesting one.
That would enough tighten things up, wouldn't it? This this is about the unexplained wealth orders, isn't it? This is it sorry, Kazakhstan, where there are questions as to how people bought houses costing zillions of pounds. Again, I go back to the Transparency International website, which I do recommend. And time and again, they're saying if you don't know who the company belongs to, you don't know where the money is going, you don't know where the money has come from, and that opens up every possibility for fraud. Now, discretion, yes. People don't necessarily want to be telling other people what it is that they're doing. Too much information could actually skew the market. If everybody starts saying, oh, I see X is doing this and Y is doing that, you might find people chasing around in the markets using this as market intelligence. I can understand why an element of confidentiality is needed. On the other hand, this does give an opportunity to the criminal fraternity to do things which we would rather they weren't doing.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Here's a quite topical one. It's going to be quite a long question, Tim, but so you can get, if you can tackle it anyway. It says there's a lot of talk in the crypto world around the idea of decentralized finance, and one of the current trends in this space is flash loans, which seem a bit like CDOs. Obviously, this is a relatively small space compared to the global financial system, but do you think there's a danger of fintech or DeFi just recreating a more complicated version of the current system?
Well, again, this is where I do fear and this is purely prejudicial on my part, the legislation does not keep up with the speed of technological advance. Now, you do have the high frequency trading issue. You have dark pools, which are discretionary areas which are used by the major organizations to the benefit of their preferred clients. These can be, there's the SEC in America, which has been around, I think, since 1934, which is meant to be sort of controlling these areas. But I think the difficulty is where you are conducting trades at hundreds, if not thousands of times a second, by the time you find it's happened, you probably can't catch up with what's going on. Now, the only thing there is, of course, if you've got joyriders on the motorway with cars which will travel at 100 miles an hour, you need police cars to catch them that can drive at 110 miles an hour. Now, this goes back to my earlier set of recommendations about training. This is such a new area. First of all, do you really have people inside the controlling bodies who actually understand these new areas of technology? And has somebody sat back and said, if I were the burglar, how would I break into this particular house? Now, those are two open-ended replies to the question, I'm afraid. But yes, I think you have to say, whenever something is invented, there is an equal and opposite force, which is somebody saying, how can I milk the system? How can I buck the system? Or how can I wreck it? Think of the enormous benefits of the internet and the person who first invented viruses and the person who first invented the dark web. Something for the benefit of everybody and being put to destructive purposes. I greatly fear with any new technology, this is a danger.
Thanks, Tim. You're proving very popular indeed. I did mention at the outset that we would have a little bit of extra time should we get extra questions, and we do seem to be getting them. So it's okay with you
carry on.
And everyone else that's stayed online, which is good. I'll chuck a couple more your way if that's okay. So first of all, might you agree with the views of D. Hock, the founder of Visa in 1970? He stated that our problems are systematic, arising from the dominant form of organizations possessing excessive power, in charge of command and control hierarchies.
Command and control, I think, comes from missile technology, which reminds me of fire and forget. No, I think this goes back to what we call moral hazard, where people assumed that organizations ranging from Arthur Andersen and Enron through to Lehman Brothers were just too big to fail. And of course, on the one hand, you have organizations which have an annual turnover which is larger than the GDP of the average European country. You do have companies with such a wide reach, so much impact on not only the national but global economy, that they quite possibly feel that they can dictate to everybody else. And I think this is where, by international agreement, and I think we can see this, something which is in the press these days, governments have got to say, so far and no more. And no, you can't be too big to fail. We know the fallout from these major collapses of recent years in particular are damaging to everybody. And we do need to make sure that the social responsibility, I come back to my ethical issue here, yes, you might be the biggest boy in the playground, but that doesn't give you the right to go around kicking everybody else. And that, I think, is where the ethics of it come in. Whether sanctions at international level will work, I somehow doubt, because if you push in one direction, you can always sidestep it and go around another way.
Thank you. And here's a slightly different take on maybe one of the earlier questions. With the nature of crime changing, does this require changes to the way law enforcement will work?
Well, again, go back to the report and you'll see that the National Fraud Office, National Fraud Agency, I think it's called, has defined 124 different forms of fraud. And I was talking to an officer from this, and he said, well, we call these the hooks with which to catch the crooks. Because once you start operating fraudulently, you do start leaving tracks, and hopefully these are things which can be followed up on. But it goes back to my basic point. There are the very old traditional forms of fraud. You've got your salami swindle, you've got your Ponzi scandals, the rest of it. But you also have the very new ones. And this is where you do need to have people who are involved almost in forensic finance and whose job is to work out if crimes are being committed in cyberspace or actually by a computer, how may these be tracked down and how may they be controlled. And that, I think, is somewhere where you need possibly some university departments with some very bright people in, just sitting around with blue sky thinking and saying, if you invent some new technology to do this, can we invent the new technology to do that?
Great. Here's another one. Which organisations might be useful in the battle against corruption?
Right. Well, I've actually got it here. You realise this is free in all good bookshops, don't you? If you go to page 91 of Get Smart About Scandals, you'll find Appendix 3, Organisations Fighting Financial Crime or Promoting Good Practice, and that runs to 2 full pages of A4. Again, I do refer to them in the chapter on the good guys. There's very good work being done by some very useful and worthwhile organisations, not, let it be said, just by the police, though they are very active. City of London Police Force is very active in this. But yes, there is a lot being done. One of my questions would be, are they all liaising with each other, or are people happily tunnelling in their particular directions because that's what they've been told to do, that's the budget they've got? Is there an overview to make sure that the benefits from the work that people are undoubtedly doing are for the maximum good?
Okay, here's another one, slightly different. What about enforcing further transparency in the remaining British overseas territories?
I would say goodbye and good luck.
One should say.
This is a very touchy issue. I'm sure government is fully aware of it. I'm not quite sure myself what the legal relationship is between the UK government and the territories. But again, I would come back to international regulation. The fact that it's an overseas territory, the fact it might be located on a very small remote island, doesn't mean to say that it's either beyond the reach of international sanctions or indeed it comes outside international law.
Okay, and I think this might be the final question, Tim, or we do have time for others if anyone would like to add any. It relates to Japan again, so maybe an expansion of the earlier question. If you are familiar with, but it looks like you are, how would you compare the Japanese and UK regulatory anti-fraud system? And is there any particular gap or difference between the two?
No, I'm afraid that is a very highly specialised question. What I would say is that the Japanese have a very long established financial system with the checks and balances in place. Whether theirs are any more effective than ours would make a very good student project. I'm sure that they have as many people looking to see that things are being done properly as everybody else. I rather fear that their legislation is behind the technology on the development of technology, as I've said before. And it would be interesting because, of course, it does have a major stock market. It is a major financial player. It would be to the mutual benefit of both London and Tokyo if people were to sit down together and actually tease out that very question.
All right, and I think I've just one more just come in, which is probably a very good one to end on, Tim. What about the role of private security companies? And someone's asked, who guards the guardians?
That's always a good one. There is a new livery company in the City of London, which is the Security Professionals. It goes back again to your standing. If you're doing something and you're doing it right, people will come to you either through recommendation or because you're the only people there. You might be the one with the highest profile. And as soon as you do something wrong, people run away from you. So if you want to stay in business, you stay on the right side of the law, which you're trying to enhance, enforce, or protect. And again, there are security companies that have been around for a very long time. They tend to be international. Again, you go back to the famous phrase due diligence. You look before you leap. You look to see what it is that companies offer. You even go to see companies which have used them for a significant period of time to check what their experience is.
Well, Tim, that's great. We've almost reached the end of our extended maximum time, and pretty much everyone that dialed in is still online. So a big thanks to you for the presentation and for taking and answering those questions so insightfully. Thank you so much. There are about 3 or 4 other questions just coming in, which unfortunately we're not going to get to. Perhaps what I could recommend is if the senders drop me an email to james_pitcher@fsclub.co.uk, and I'll pass them on to Tim, and we'll get back to you with an answer, and maybe we'll find a way of getting the answers to those questions added to our event website, where we already have the slides, and there will be shortly a recording of this webinar. So thanks again to Tim. On the screen, we're closing with the list of upcoming webinars. There's at least one a week for the foreseeable future, and we'll almost certainly be adding others to that. So again, thanks to Tim, thanks to everyone, and hopefully you can join us on future webinars.
Thanks ever so much, everybody.